All right, it looks like people are streaming in and we are at time. Matt, are you okay with me going ahead to get started? Awesome. So welcome everybody to our K-CART seminar. This is our first talk of the spring 2022 series. Today we have Ms. Gretchen Scheibel and Dr. Howard Wells presenting. Just a couple of Zoom procedures before we get started. We ask that everybody remain muted during the presentation, but you can feel free to leave your video on. And for questions, Ms. Scheibel let me know that she's okay with you going ahead and unmuting and asking your question if you have any along the way. And feel free to post some questions in the chat and I can ask them as well. You can find a complete schedule for the semester of the rest of the talks under the events tab on the K-CART website. Next week, we have Dr. Jessica Hellings from the KU Medical Center on February 3rd, who will be presenting. So our speakers today are Ms. Gretchen Scheibel and Dr. Howard Wells. Dr. Scheibel is a doctoral student. Ms. Scheibel is a doctoral student in special education at the University of Kansas and an implementation coordinator at the Juniper Gardens Children's Project. She's practiced as an occupational therapist and a BCBA for over 15 years and focused mainly on children with ASD exhibiting severe and dangerous behaviors. And Dr. Wells is a professor of educational psychology at KU. He's a senior scientist at the Juniper Gardens Children's Project. He received his MBA at KU in 2006 and his PhD in developmental and child psych also at KU in 2002 and is a board certified behavior analyst as well. Today they will be sharing some information from a recent meta-analysis and evidence review of Iconx, a technology-based self-monitoring platform that supports children on the autism spectrum to be more aware of and adjust their behavior to better participate in school, home, and community activities. And this session will include current research supporting the use of Iconx for children with ASD and free resources to support the use of Iconx at school, home, and community. Thanks so much for being here. Go ahead, Ms. Scheibel.
Great, thank you so much, Maggie. I'm really excited to be here. And as Maggie said, I'm Gretchen Scheibel. Dr. Wills is not going to be able to join us today during the presentation. He had a conflict pop up, but I believe he's on the phone. So you may hear his voice show up and answer questions if we have some. But I will be doing the bulk of the presenting today. So like Maggie said, my name is Gretchen and Dr. Howard Wills and I work together at Juniper Gardens. We work on a grant researching this intervention called Iconx, which you guys are going to hear quite a bit about today. And what you're going to hear about is the full intervention that we're researching through this grant. So the intervention has been developed and like you'll see, we have a lot of research behind it, but now we have a grant at from the Office of Special Education Programs, and that grant is to develop implementation resources. So today, what I hope to do is give you guys an idea of what Iconx is as an intervention, what supports we have available to help implementation, and the evidence we have to support it. Before I kind of get into that, I would love to know just who we have here. It looks like we have quite a few people on the call. So if you could just drop in the chat who you are and what your role is, if you're a practitioner, if you're a parent, if you're an individual on the spectrum, or if you're a researcher, that would be very helpful to know. And Maggie, I cannot see the chat without looking way over here. So if you could kind of just give me a heads up of what's happening in there, that would be great.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, so today we're going to talk about, like I said, an introduction to self-monitoring, which is the evidence-based practice that Iconx uses. And then we'll go through the evidence for Iconx to target positive behaviors, and we'll go through some free resources. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar, self-monitoring is a really exciting and interesting skill. So as a practitioner, I use self-monitoring interventions all of the time. And I did that because self-monitoring interventions are really adaptable. So you can use them with individuals who have lots of different support needs, but also they are really versatile. So you can use them across lots of different outcomes. And they're fairly feasible. They're fairly easy to implement. So as a practitioner, they're a really good tool to have like in your toolkit, but they're also really powerful, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if you're not familiar with self-monitoring, it's essentially a metacognitive skill. And it has two components to it. So first, you teach the student or the child to be aware of their behavior. They start to learn what a certain behavior looks like, and that behavior can be anything that's observable. So a really common one is paying attention or staying on task. So you teach the student to be aware of their behavior, and then because they're more aware of it, you have them start recording whether or not the behavior has occurred. And what that recording does is it helps students to continue to be more aware, right? So it's like you teach them to be aware, and then you teach them to be persistently aware of their behavior. And this intervention has a ton of benefits, right? So just increasing a child's awareness of their behavior and then increasing that awareness over time. First, it can do all sorts of things, right? So it can improve or increase that target behavior, whatever you're encouraging them to be more aware of. But the really cool part about it is in the intervention itself, the student is the implementer. So the practitioner or the adult that's helping the child, they set up the intervention, they teach the child how to use the intervention, but when the intervention is running, when it's being used, the child is the person who's doing it, or the student's the person who's actually implementing it. So it's student driven. So it gives children more choice in their intervention. And it's highly individualizable, right? So you can select the behavior, you can select the way that it's recorded, you can select the frequency that it's recorded. So you can really customize it to specific children's needs. Another great benefit of self-monitoring is it's not just that, in practice, we see that this is an effective intervention. The research is really clear on this type of intervention. It's been researched for 40 years in schools, in clinics, at home, out in the community. The results are overwhelmingly positive. So this type of intervention is very effective. It has positive effects to increase desirable behaviors. So it works to increase target behaviors. And there is some evidence to suggest that it decreases undesirable behaviors, the behaviors that we want to see less of. And as I said earlier, it's really effective across this broad range of children. And actually, we have some studies that suggest that it is effective with adults as well. So it's really kind of applicable across a broad age range. We see it it's effective across genders. So it's very effective for children and young adults with ASD, but also co-occurring disabilities. So we know lots of individuals on the spectrum tend to have comorbidities. It tends to be incredibly effective across all of these different disabilities, and it's effective across settings. So it's a really, really valuable tool. The evidence that we've seen supporting just self-monitoring, especially in schools, is that self-monitoring can improve academic engagement behaviors by 5 minutes for every session that it's used. So every time a student uses self-monitoring, we talk about the session, which is how long they monitor their behavior. And when there was a moderator analysis that was recently done, they looked at when self-monitoring was used for academic engagement, what was the effect of that? And it was that for every session that it was being used, they saw an increase of 5 minutes of engagement behavior. And then there was a collateral decrease in disruptive behaviors by 5 minutes a session. So that's a pretty significant gain in skills for kids, especially in the classroom. Interval lengths can be less than 5 minutes. They shouldn't be over 5 minutes. When the interval lengths get longer, then students tend to get a little bit more distracted and aren't aren't as good at maintaining their behavior for long periods of time. When we looked at self-monitoring in the classroom, technology-based self-monitoring is the most effective. So when we think about self-monitoring, we can do technology-based self-monitoring where we're using an app or like a mobile tablet of some sort to record behavior. The old school way to do it, so previously in the last 40 years, before everyone had an iPad or an iPhone, people just used pen and paper. But what we've found when we've looked at the research is technology-based self-monitoring can be more effective. And then when we combine self-monitoring with reinforcement and feedback, we tend to see stronger effects. So when you start adding self-monitoring into more supplemental interventions, when you add those into the self-monitoring intervention, you can see stronger effects. So we have a lot of evidence suggesting that self-monitoring can be effective, especially in classrooms. Self-monitoring can be used with lots of students, and it has lots of benefits to it. But let's talk about what it means to actually self-monitor. So if you're going to implement self-monitoring, what that means is you're looking at identifying a target behavior. So you want to identify the behavior that you want the student to monitor. Then you're looking at the monitoring period, so how long they're going to monitor. And then you're going to look at the recording method. How are you going to help the student to record their behavior over time? And this is where self-monitoring can get a little tricky, especially for implementers and teachers in the classroom or parents at home that want to use this. It gets really hard to do this. It looks deceptively simple on this slide. It's like, oh, just do these 3 things. It's super easy. But really, there's a lot of little decisions that go into each of these components, especially to individualize it for the individual who's going to be self-monitoring. And there's a lot of ways that you can go about doing that, but Iconx was really designed to make this process a lot easier. So it was designed to help, especially teachers, but it's really been used out in the community and at home, but it's been designed to make this process easier. So Iconx, as an intervention, it's a self-monitoring platform. So that's what we call it. It's a platform that helps you to use self-monitoring. It's a free platform, so all the resources are free, access to the app is free, and the web portal is all free. Again, it's highly customizable. So all of the things that you would normally customize in a self-monitoring intervention, you customize in the Iconx portal with prompts that help you to do that. There's also a secondary feature to Iconx, which is that it provides you with a chart of the student's monitoring performance. So it helps you to monitor progress over time. One thing we find with especially teachers who use self-monitoring is it's really easy to put it in place, and then people tend to kind of fade out without knowing whether or not it actually worked or if the student was ready to fade. So we have a chart option that gives you the data, makes it really easy to collect data and look at data. And it has another really cool feature, which is that you can connect all of these different components to the student. So the student can look at their charts and what they're doing. And then obviously the teacher can, but you can share it with other stakeholders in the child's life. So community support providers, parents, other maybe like general education teachers, if the special education teacher is in charge. So it supports collaboration and wraparound services for students and children who are using the app. Okay. I just want to pause and make sure there's no questions at this point. It doesn't seem like it. Okay.
I haven't seen any in the chat, and it looks like most people are coming from either a clinician or like a clinician in or a clinical researcher position.
Great. Okay. Thank you guys so much.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So when you're talking about these like intervals of self-monitoring, like being limited to 5 minutes. I guess I may have missed this, but is this like every 5 minutes they get a reminder to say how much did you notice your behavior?
Yes.
Okay. Yep. And so they're kind of getting a cue that they're like, you know, maybe veering off task and have to reset.
Yeah. Thank you. It's such a great question. So with self-monitoring in general, there's all sorts of ways to do it, but with Iconx, that's exactly how it works. So Iconx has these two different parts to it. So there's the web portal, and that's where you design the intervention. And then there's the app, and that's where the actual monitoring occurs. And it's just like you said. So it's an app where you download it, the student starts monitoring. And what you can see on the screen here is exactly what it looks like. So you set an interval and this little prompt pops up. And if you're monitoring like on task behavior, which is like one of the most common behaviors that people monitor, it'll ask a question like, are you on task? You can, the way that Iconx works is you can customize that question so that prompt can be customized to whatever target behavior you're looking for. But that pops up at whatever interval you set it at. So what the research has found in general, self-monitoring literature is anything less than 5 minutes is pretty good. So you could set it for 3 minutes, and you could set this for a fixed or a variable interval. So it could occur every 3 minutes or an average of 3 minutes. But what happens is when that little prompt pops up, the student selects yes or no. So they can say, yes, I'm on task, or no, I'm not on task. And then it records that data, and that's what is presented in the chart. Is that helpful?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Great.
Gretchen, can I ask one other question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm thinking of, I'm sure as other clinicians are, like I'm thinking of a very specific patient who some of the distractibility or the off task is on like the iPhone or iPad itself. So when you're using the app, are you putting it in like a guided discovery mode to where they can't even get onto other apps and like this is the only thing? I can just see them instantly navigating then over to like the other games that are on their device.
Yeah, like such a good question. And that is literally like, we get that question all of the time. So I wasn't part of the design of this process. I came in like after the app was designed, and it was really interesting to hear about how Dr. Wills and his team designed the app, because that was like a really big question, right? Is like, well, what we don't want is we don't want kids to, you know, be like, oh, my phone is dinging. Great, I should check Snapchat. You know, like that's a great time for me to remember that my phone is here. But also one of the things that we wanted to do with this intervention is make it highly customizable, right? So there's like all these decisions that have to be made around, you know, how the app works and runs in the background. So that's like a long-winded answer to say the way that app works on a phone or a tablet is it only monitors when the app is open. So if you close the app, it stops monitoring. Which can be a problem, right? If students are like, cool, I remember my phone is here, so now I'm going to go check Snapchat or whatever I'm going to do on it. But lots of people use like that like guided, you know, like the lockdown features to say, no, you can't navigate from this screen. So there's that. But also, you guys are like just doing this presentation for me. You're just moving right to the next slides. So this is perfect. So you can download the Iconx app on mobile devices, so on Android or on Apple. But what we've also found is because that's such a problem, right? Like monitoring on a separate device can be such a problem. Another problem we had was like students who were using a mobile device as a communication support. Then they couldn't like kind of use that device like dual purpose. So what we ended up doing was designing a desktop version of the app. So now there's lots of different like devices that you can use the app on. And if you use the desktop version, then it does run in the background. So it's like a little bit more integrated into the system. So it's really can be designed in any way that works for your specific client or student. Did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so I just want to make this clear because this is a little bit tricky with Iconx. So we have a web portal, and that is where like clinicians or practitioners or parents or students sign up for an account. So they sign up and then they sign up for the student account. The app itself is just the monitoring platform, right? So that's just what the student uses to monitor. The web platform is really where everything is designed and where you customize all the features. You can view graphs in both places, but on the web portal, obviously they're bigger and more exciting. So we have those two different features, and we have the app. It says coming soon for Chromebooks, but actually it's already here. So we're ahead of the curve. So, and we did that. We added Chromebooks specifically because what we found is so many school districts use only Chromebooks. So we found that when we launched the app, there was a lot of schools who weren't able to use it. They really wanted to use it in their classrooms, but they couldn't because they only had Chromebooks. So now we have Chromebooks available. Okay, so I think that should give you guys like just a dip your toe in idea of what Iconx is and the different kind of components of it. So it's a self-monitoring platform that makes it easy to implement self-monitoring. Next, I'm going to share with you guys the results of a meta-analysis we did on Iconx. So the first study of Iconx came out in 2014. So it's been studied for the last 6-7 years now. And it has been, it's been growing over time. We're seeing lots of people replicating the studies that Dr. Wills' team has done. And we're seeing it, there's been a lot of research in schools, but we're seeing it kind of move out into the home and community environments as well. So let's go through, how does Iconx actually help students in the classroom? So what you see here is a graph from one of the studies that we did with Iconx. And it was hard to pick one graph for this slide because they're all really interesting. But the thing that I want to kind of point out to you is that all of the graphs when Iconx is used look really similar. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with single case design, but we've used single case research design for most of these studies. And the way that the graphs work is on the y-axis, you have the intervals or the percentage of time the student is on task, and the x-axis is the number of sessions. The data path is, of course, the on-task behavior. And this one is showing a withdrawal design where we had a baseline phase. We introduced Iconx for a couple sessions, then we withdrew it again for a second baseline condition, and then we reintroduced it. What you can see here is that Iconx tends to have a really strong and immediate increase on task behavior. And again, it was hard to pick a graph because all of the graphs kind of look like this, and they all have some interesting features. But what you see here from baseline to intervention, that jump, is really consistent with almost every graph that we have. So every study we've done, we see this really abrupt change that as soon as the student starts monitoring their behavior using Iconx, there's a strong increase in on-task behavior. Another part of this is, so all the studies that are not all, but many of the studies that we have of Iconx look at on-task behavior. So improving just the actual behavior of on-task, which is the behavior that the student is monitoring for. So they're saying, am I on task? Yes or no throughout the session. We also measured collateral outcomes. So in this graph that you're seeing, the data path represents task completion. So the y-axis is the percentage of items completed during the session. And you can see here, so in baseline, the student was less than 30% completing what was asked of them during that session. And then when Iconx was being used, it went up to 100%. So what we can see is that for this student, when he was more on task, there was a collateral increase in task completion. We'll talk a little bit more about this outcome in another slide, but I think this is another really cool part of Iconx and self-monitoring in general, that you have the ability to help a student build a positive behavior, so they can strengthen a positive behavior, but then that positive behavior has collateral impacts for them in their school or their home lives. Okay, so when we did our meta-analysis, we found 9 peer-reviewed research studies and 3 dissertations and theses. Within this broader group, we had 19 students and 1 adult, all of whom had a disability, most of whom had ASD, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but every participant so far has been an individual with a disability, and all of the studies so far have looked at improvements in on-task or task engagement, academic, and behavior outcomes. So what we wanted to know in this meta-analysis was, with this literature base, how does this inform the use of Iconx? So we had developed an intervention, we had done a lot of research on it, and now we're in this grant where we are developing implementation supports. So we wanted our implementation supports to be driven by the research that has accumulated from this intervention. So what we know from this literature is not all of those studies that we saw looked at on-task behavior. So we removed the studies that didn't look at on-task behavior. We just synthesized studies that looked at on-task behavior. But when we're thinking about on-task behavior, when we're thinking about improving task engagement, what we saw is the participants included all the way from upper elementary school through high school. And they carried the following eligibility categories: autism spectrum disorder, with varying support needs across the spectrum. So we had students who needed pretty extensive supports. We also had students who needed fairly minimal social supports and minimal behavioral supports. We had students with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We had 1 student that had both ASD and ADHD at the same time, students with learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities. So a pretty broad group of students. And I don't think I have the slide in here, but the majority of the students that we looked at did have a ASD. So that was our main population that we found. We also looked at how could students be best trained to use Iconx. So some of you were probably thinking, as we were talking about self-monitoring being this kind of 2-step process, which is just train the student to be aware of their behavior and then have them record it. That training part can be really tricky. So training students to become aware of their behavior and then to accurately record whether or not that behavior is occurring. So we wanted to really spotlight and look at, well, how, at least in the research, how are we training students, and how are, what does that look like as far as effect? What we found is that in the research, the behavior skills training model or explicit training model was by far the most common. It wasn't consistent across studies, so people used various different components of this model, but loosely all studies followed this, the basic package where a rationale was presented for why the student would benefit from this type of intervention. There was some sort of modeling with examples or non-examples. There was usually a practice to criterion session where the student practiced monitoring with the teacher right there. And there was an established criterion where in order to move into using the app independently, they had to show that they were able to accurately record their behavior. And lots of students got feedback. So that model was used for all students, but we also saw lots of different supplemental methods kind of sprinkled in. So we saw use of video self models. There was an online module called ASD on the go that was used in one study, and lots of studies included just like a general discussion where the student was a more active participant. So the student offered their thoughts on the different components of the intervention, like how long that interval would be, or how long they should monitor for. Some students offered their thoughts on what the prompt should be. So, everyone was in agreement that the student was going to monitor on-task behavior, like an engagement behavior, but the student wanted to change the prompt. So change what that question was to make it more meaningful to them. So there's all sorts of supplemental methods. And what we think that means is that there's this base training model that's really useful, but also it's important to customize that training phase to your student and their individual needs. Training ranged from 20 to 60 minutes with an average of 42 minutes. But what we found when we really looked at the data was the 60 minutes, the students who received 60 minutes of training more often were the students who also had reinforcement included. So they were self-monitoring, and then they received reinforcement if they met like a benchmark or a criteria. So those students got more training on the front end. And we think that's probably because in order to get that reinforcement at the end, they need to be monitoring accurately, right? So they need to actually be on task when they say they're on task. But I think this is a good point at the clinician or practitioner stage to think about that. That's a good amount of time to plan for, is about 60 minutes of training. It could be less than that, could be a lot less than that, could just be 20 minutes depending on your student. But again, this is like an adaptation point. Then we looked at those different self-monitoring intervals that we saw in their research studies. So if you remember earlier, when we look at the broader self-monitoring literature, 5-minute intervals tend to be best. So, anything less than 5 minutes tends to be best. When we looked at the Iconx literature, what we found is we had one study where 2 students monitored every 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes, they monitored whether or not they were on task. But the bulk of the students, the other huge group of students, they all monitored for under 60 minutes. We had one student who monitored every 15 seconds, and we had another that monitored every 20 seconds, and then most monitored every 30 seconds. We had 2 that did every 60 seconds or every minute. So again, there's a wide spread, there's a lot of variation, but what that tells us is, again, that this probably should be customized to your specific student. Another thing to think about, I think is important to think about, is when a student is monitoring at a really short interval, like every 15 seconds or every 20 seconds, that requires quite a big attention shift, right? So they have to stop what they're doing, monitor, and then return back to the task. And for some kiddos, that can be really challenging. So while a shorter interval may be more likely to address the target behavior, so if you're looking at something like on-task behavior, you have a short interval and they're constantly saying, yes, I'm on task, yes, I'm on task, then they are very likely to be on task more, which is great. but they're also not likely to get much done in between those monitoring sessions or monitoring periods. So maybe 10 seconds between monitoring periods where they are able to work on something before they have to return to monitoring. It's just not a lot of time. So what we think is when you're selecting these interval schedules, it's important to think about what is your goal here. Is your goal just to change the behavior that's being monitored for? And if so, then lower intervals are probably great for that. But if you're looking at those collateral outcomes, right, like task completion, you're maybe not going to see a change in task completion if your monitoring intervals are really short, because students just don't have enough time. So again, it's another adaptation point and a chance to individualize. We also looked at outcomes. So we looked at outcomes for all the different studies and all the different participants. And this was a single case research design synthesis. So we used visual analysis to look at the graphs and determine if there was a functional relation present when the intervention was introduced following baseline. What we saw was a functional relation was detected every time. So every student, when we used Iconx, we saw a demonstration of effect. And like I mentioned before with that other graph, there was this immediate strong effect, right? So it's really easy for teachers to know, yes, this intervention is working because it worked immediately, which was really cool. And then we ran a meta-analysis. So I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with single case research design and synthesis, but we calculated a parametric effect size for each of the comparisons. So every time the intervention was introduced following baseline, we calculated an individual effect size for that. And we got an average effect of 0.86, which is pretty good. At this point in time, we don't have, there's no established scale for interpretation of this effect size. But what we do know is that the effect was positive. So we didn't have a confidence interval that crossed the 0 threshold. All of our effects are positive. Our meta-analytic statistic is positive. Our confidence interval is positive. So what we can say is that you're very likely to experience positive effects when you implement Iconx. Because we don't have interpretation for this effect size yet, we can't say how much you can expect, but we are confident in saying you can expect positive effects. And the last thing we did is we looked at the rigor of the designs that we were synthesizing. So we compared them to the What Works Clearinghouse standards, which are evidence design or evidence standards for educational interventions. And we had 14 designs, 12 of them met these standards without reservations, and only 2 of them met with they met standards just with reservations, and that's just because they didn't have enough data points. They had 4 data points instead of 5. So we're pretty confident in saying that this body of literature is rigorous and of high quality. So we have a lot of confidence in the outcomes that we saw. Okay, I've done a lot of talking. I want to pause again and just see if anyone has any questions.
Okay, I have a question, Gretchen.
Yeah.
So kids that that have inattention are often impulsive as well. Can it be a problem that they throw the phone or that sort of stuff?
That's a very good question. I think, I mean, I haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure that they do. It's, you know, that happens with pretty much any intervention with that type of student or that type of child. and it's kind of the same rules that you would use for any other intervention, that you would just keep going, you would represent it, or, kind of go down whatever path you would normally go down if the student throws the device. But another way to kind of think about it is, if you do have a student who's really impulsive, and they're likely to kind of throw the device, they may not be ready for self-monitoring, that this might not be a good intervention for them, because it really does require the student to be quite independent. We want students to be independent. We want this to be a learning process for them. And if they're at a point where they're not able to regulate themselves, and manage emotions in that way, then there's maybe some other things that we need to do before we get to self-monitoring.
Great, thanks. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Gretchen, I have one other one. Is there like a type of task maybe that this is best for? So I'm thinking, for an older student who was, say, writing an essay, something like this might be challenging, where it might break out of your train of thought. It might break the sustained distance where you need to maintain it for longer. So is it targeted towards younger kids for just shorter activities, or how is that working developmentally?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So one thing we did in this meta-analysis is we looked at the different tasks that were being completed while the student was monitoring. So the large majority of students were doing independent work, and most of them weren't doing independent work that was like that, like a lengthy, cognitively heavy task like writing an essay. They were doing things like filling out worksheets, or completing math problems, where there was it wasn't such a long sustained task. So it is good for independent work. But I also want to point out that we had lots of students who used it in the general education environment, and they used it across task formats. So there is some evidence to suggest that it's not just independent work, like instruction or like group work. It also worked for that. But in that case that you bring up, like the idea of an essay or a, like kind of a more cognitively intense task, I think that's another opportunity to think about the interval, and whether or not the interval, if you could adjust the interval to a place where it, it wasn't so intrusive. I mean, again, it's a very individualized question, right? Like for a student, like you would have to say, is this a good fit? Is this a good fit for the student in this moment? And there was something else I was thinking about. Can't remember. But you had also asked about younger students. What we saw is that task format, like that independent task format, was pretty consistent across the age ranges. So we did see students who are older using this type of thing, but again, they weren't using that type of task that you're describing.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay, I don't think so. So I just want to go over two other kind of cool features of Iconx that I think make it a really interesting intervention and a way that can be really useful. So there's the charts that I talked about earlier. So you can see on this screen here, this is the chart that the student can see. So the charts have, in my mind, two benefits to them. One, it helps the teacher or the implementer to make decisions around whether or not to continue with the intervention or to change it in some way. You can share that information with other people, which is great. But also, it's a really great place to start showing the student, this is what your progress is, and get them involved in that intervention process and help them to develop advocacy skills. I was running a study before the pandemic where there was a student who was using Iconx during a study hall, And what he found was he felt like the thing that was hard for him about Iconx was he had to push the button. It was like the ding that helped him. So like when the prompt pops up, it can chime, or it can vibrate, or it can flash, or there can be like no sound. But for this student, he said, I just needed to hear the chime. And I didn't really need to do anything else. It just reminded me to stay on task over and over again. And that came up because he looked at his chart with his teacher, and his chart said he was not responding, right? So just like the whole bar was yellow. It just said no response. And his teacher was like, what happened? Like, I saw you using Iconx and it seemed like you really liked it. Like what happened? And he said, oh no, I'm using it and it's great. I really like it. It's just that I don't want to push the button. And so it was a place for him to say, here's what I like about this intervention. Here's how I'm going to use it in a way that's really useful for me. So it like helped him to develop his advocacy skills, which was really neat. Okay. And then the second feature that we're talking about here is the collaboration between home and school. So because you have that option to share these charts, you can add a parent or an outside service provider as a stakeholder, and you can use Iconx at home to encourage generalization. So I'm running a study right now where we are looking at implementing Iconx with high school students with ASD. And what we're hoping to do is use Iconx in the classroom with the teacher. And then when we do our generalization condition, use it at home with a parent, so that the parent has an opportunity to use it at home and see if it's beneficial at home. But the reason why we want to do that is we want to look at kind of the secondary feature of Iconx, that it has this ability to kind of be a wraparound intervention, that it can be used at home, it can be used at school, it can be used in the community. And then it has this kind of communication feature where everyone can be on the same page about their students. And if you guys happen to know any high school students with ASD who want to be in a study, I would love to talk to you. So feel free to email me if that is something that you have access to. Okay, so we're just towards the end here. I think we have just a couple minutes left. I just wanted to share a couple quick free resources for you guys. Now, what you guys just went through was like kind of a very quick overview of all the different features and things that you could do with Iconx, but we've created a user guide that goes through step by step. So some of you probably are familiar with self-monitoring interventions. You may not need this level of detail, but if you're consulting with like a parent or a teacher or a home care provider, we have this user guide that really breaks it down into really simple implementation steps. And you can use this barcode to scan and get directly there. But we've also differentiated our user guide. So we have, we call the mentor user guide, which is more for teachers in a classroom. We have a student user guide, which is if the student is using the intervention. So they are either using it without a teacher. So an individual with ASD is like, nope, I just want to self-monitor on my own. I don't want anybody else involved in this. We have a user guide just for that. And then another part of that user guide is if there is a mentor or somebody else helping them, it's kind of explains that role and who that person would be. And then we have a third user guide, which is the non-school district affiliated mentor user guide. And that's for home care providers, parents. We have lots of parents who are really interested in using this at home. And we have a fourth user guide that's really looking at implementing it as an intervention across the school district. So we have lots of free resources. And within those user guides, there's all sorts of tools associated with them. So we've really built out most of our implementations for classroom implementation, so teacher implementation. So we have the user guide. We have a study guide that where teachers can read through the user guide and kind of solidify their knowledge base. We have a scoring tool that goes along with that. So if you want to give it to a teacher and make sure that they are prepared to implement it, you can score their user guide. We have a troubleshooting guide because we find that some people run into problems where they set up the intervention, they do the thing, and then the student doesn't respond. Their behavior doesn't change, or they run into some problem. So we have a troubleshooting guide that kind of goes through some of the more common things that you might see. We have a quick start video that goes through like the technology side of it. So navigating the web portal, working through how to, when to use the app and how to use it. And then we have videos on how to meet with a student and talk about their progress. And our home user guide has a lot of those same things, but less of that kind of like oversight, like training materials. This is really geared towards, supporting parents to put this in place at home in a way that they can do it on their own without involving service providers. And then we have that independent user guide for students. And I think that is it. So any more questions?
Well, I think this sounds like a really great intervention. And I think that typically developing students could benefit from it too, most likely. Especially medical students that have to sit and study for hours and hours and hours. And I know medical students often use food to keep themselves sitting, studying, like chocolates and all those good things. But this could be a way that if they're not going to use food, they could just do it without and sort of get in the reinforced sort of habit of enjoying achieving what they do.
We agree. So there's a number of people around the office who use it, and we have to go through the database quite frequently to find like, what are test accounts, and every once in a while we come up across a test account that's just someone at Juniper Gardens, and we're always like, we have to go to them and be like, are you using this personally, or is it like, were you just testing it? Like, are you using it? And like, more often than not, we're hearing people say like, no, actually, it helps me to focus, especially since we got it on desktops. It really helps people to like stay focused on whatever they're supposed to be doing. So it is great. And yeah, I agree. It is a great tool for everyone. And I mean, I think what's cool about it is it's so customizable, right? You can use it for all sorts of things.
Cool. Very nice.
Thanks. Any other questions?
I apologize if you mentioned this. I got up for a few minutes to see if you had tried it with, I guess, kind of proactive other kind of social behaviors. So just within that short period of time, prompting people to talk to someone or get up and engage in an activity types of thing.
So we haven't done any official studies on that. We have done studies on stereotypy. So we have a couple studies on stereotypy and, making sure that like your hands are where they're supposed to be, that kind of thing. So we have that. We have a few studies on that. And then we have another study that Dr. Wills did with an adult in a workplace. And this adult had some vocalizations that were just not entirely appropriate for the workplace, and she wanted to stop engaging in these vocalizations because it was really getting in the way of her developing peer relationships. And so she used Iconx for that, to monitor that she was not engaging in these vocalizations. So that's as far as we've gone. But I think that there's plenty of applications that would be really interesting to study further.
Gretchen, that was a really nice presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think some nice practical applications when we're sort of used to being on the very far removed side from that. I'm interested in kind of how reward affects behavior in ASD. And I think in some of the studies that I have done, we've sort of shown that it really doesn't take a lot to kind of improve behavior. It's more just kind of getting the feedback. And so I think that this is a really nice parallel of showing that kind of just engaging attentional systems or the self-monitoring systems is really effective, even in the absence of any sort of extrinsic motivator like food for a medical student or something like that. So just that was a nice for me to see.
Great. Oh, I'm so glad. That's a cool connection to make. We have some really very preliminary evidence to suggest that. So, I mentioned, I think briefly during that, in our group of studies, about half of them had supplemental reinforcement. So about half of the students monitored and then got reinforcement at the end, and then about half of them didn't. And there is not a big difference between their effect sizes. So it really, and it's like, and I think, Dr. Wills really likes to talk about this, and I also enjoy just chatting about this, like, what is actually the mechanism of change for self-monitoring? Is it, and it's like that the student said, like, I don't need to push the button. I just need the reminder. Like, he just needed the auditory reminder to stay on task. Then he was just ready to go. He didn't need anything else. I think, just in my experience in this literature and in practice, it's so hyper individualized to the student, their needs in the moment. I think, that could even shift for that student with a certain task and a certain task demand. But some of the evidence we have suggests that, reinforcement, it's not always better. It takes longer, the student's in training longer. It requires the teacher to pay attention, or, whoever is issuing the reinforcement, they have to kind of pay attention to make sure that the student is actually monitoring accurately. So there's a lot more that goes into it when you add a supplemental intervention. And I think it's interesting to think of, like, well, what's the benefit of that? Like,
right. Yeah. It's interesting too that you seem to find that this is really effective across a variety of individuals. Just some of the things that we've seen have really shown that there's variability in how individuals are responding. And I think even some of the other intervention research in autism would suggest that the effectiveness is highly variable, especially for something like reinforcement or reward-based trainings. So it's interesting that there's less of that variability here.
Oh my gosh. Yes, I know. I agree. I think it's so fascinating. It's the same, this literature is the same as all the ASD literature. There's just not enough participant description to get a really good idea of, what the spread is of symptoms and severity and impact of those symptoms, and whether or not those symptoms were actually a problem in that environment at that period of time. And it's like, I think about that a lot in ASD research, is just how can we better report that? How can we report that in a way that's meaningful? Because it's just like you said, there's so much variability, and there does seem to be, like, at least in some interventions, like a difference in responding.
Yeah, so it's possible that there is here too. It's just not captured by the data that you have because the participants are not characterized well enough. That's a good point.
Yeah. Any other questions? I think we're just at 5 o'clock. I want to be cautious of everyone's time. Okay, it looks like we're good. So I think you guys had a lot of really great questions. They really appreciated everything. Again, if you happen to know any high school students who would benefit from this intervention, who have ASD, please let me know. I'd be happy to chat with them and their families or their teachers. We're trying to do a study where we're looking at these implementation supports that we've created, and can we, very hands-off on the research team side, can we train teachers to implement this intervention in a way that's effective for students? So if you have any thoughts for us, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Sounds good, Gretchen. I just want to say thank you for that wonderful presentation. Obviously, it's very engaging for a lot of us, and really cool data to see. So thank you for doing that. Thank you, Howard, if you can hear us as well, for putting this talk forward. But Gretchen, fantastic job. And we were talking before about how really one of the major purposes of this research seminar series has been to get folks in touch with one another. And so I hope that some of these conversations, both in terms of recruitment and about the actual work as well, continue forward. So please feel free to reach out to us via email, any of us, Gretchen, and those in the audience, please feel free to reach out to Gretchen and further this conversation. So great talk though. Thanks a lot for doing it.
Great, thank you.
All right, see everyone later.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.